Welcome to our panel discussion. We have a pleasure of having with us 5 prominent panelists, each of them bringing their specific experience regarding to the topic of our mini conference. Let me start by introducing Alicja Switon. She is the interim executive manager of the Women Against Violence Europe, the well-known WAVE. And she will bring the experience of leading WAVE network during the COVID crisis with all the challenges that they have faced. And she'll bring also the focus on WAVE's intersectional and survivor-focused approach. Welcome, Alicja.
Welcome. Hi.
Our next panelist is Daniela Hirt. She's a board member of the Federal Association for the Work with Perpetrators of Domestic Violence in Germany. And they have developed the standards for work with perpetrators of domestic violence, which has been endorsed by the German government. Specifically today, she will be talking about how networking was key to professional and fast response to the COVID crisis. Welcome, Daniela.
Thank you, Dean.
Our third panelist comes from Italy. He's Davide Parma. He is a psychotherapist who works with perpetrators of domestic violence and offenders in prison. Davide has been very much involved in work with perpetrators during this crisis, and will be giving a brief overview on how to work with perpetrators and experiences from Italy throughout the lockdown. And we know that Italy had a specific situation very much. At the same time, he'll be talking about how to address the new questions and challenges that have emerged throughout the work, mostly online. Welcome, Davide.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you.
Our next panelist, Melissa Petrangelo Scaia, is currently in a few time zones away from us. I understand it's about middle of the night, wherever you are.
Yes, it's about 2:43 a.m.
Wow. Thank you for being us tonight or today.
Yeah.
Melissa is Director of International Training for Global Rights for Women, and she has a wealth of experience as the former Executive Director of Domestic Abuse Intervention Program, also known as the world-famous Duluth model. So we look forward to hearing your views regarding the current situation that we're all facing. And our fifth panelist is Rosie Jarvis, who is a national program leader within the Respect in Great Britain. She is a leader of the Drive, which is a partnership formed from Respect, Save Lives, and Social Finance. Drive is a specific response to high harm perpetrators of domestic abuse and violence, and she has overseen Drive's practice response to the COVID-19 crisis and coordinated Respect's initial development of the practitioners' guidance in this situation. So welcome, Rosie.
Hi, thank you.
Okay. Now, before we start this, I would expect exciting panel. I would like to invite and encourage participants of this mini conference to write any questions towards the panelists in the chat. We will be collecting your questions and your comments throughout the panel, and then in the question and answer period, we will ask the panelists to respond to them. It would help if you indicate who the question is for. Is it for specific panelists or the general question to all panelists? So after the panel discussion, we will have opportunity for the audience to get interactive also with the panelists, but basically we will be responding to your questions. We will start with the first of the 3 guiding questions that we have prepared to facilitate the discussion. Our first guiding question is, what is the role of perpetrator programs in preventing violence in a crisis like this one? I will ask any of the panelists to start this panel. I'm not going to call you on, but do refer to the first guiding questions, and then we have 2 more that will bring up after about 10 minutes. Yes, please go on, Alicja.
So I will start because I will maybe give a bit of an introduction to answer to this question, because this is obviously a big question that needs a lot of reflection, and probably will not even fully be able to answer it today. But coming from WAVE Network, so a network of 160 organizations that work directly or indirectly, also experts, combating violence against women, also working with survivors of women in 46 European countries. We have gathered during the last 4 months a lot of knowledge about the situation that has been there with women's support services, and how the COVID-19 crisis influenced violence against women and the life of women in Europe. And as Alessandra already mentioned before, there has been an increase of violence. We know this, around 20 to 30%. There are no yet comprehensive reports that would actually show us also the regional division of violence. However, we know one thing. Actually, COVID-19 has not created the crisis of violence against women. We know that the increase of violence has been noticed only there when the confinement measures were implemented. This is very important. So this is very important for the future crisis situations, that increase of violence is related to confinement measures and not to the disease itself. And therefore, it's also important that the increase of violence shows just something what has been before. So the crisis of violence against women that has been in the society before the COVID-19 crisis. What has, however, changed, and what is important for the women's support services and for the perpetrators programs, is the shift in the paradigm. So we have greatly changed way of work from the offline, face-to-face, in-person meetings to online work. That has been a big challenge for women's support services, but also it will be a challenge, and it has been a challenge for perpetrators programs. However, what hasn't changed were the mechanisms of violence. This has not changed. It just moved to different areas. So we would see an increase in cyber violence. However, what we would say that it is very important that seeing this increase of violence and seeing that the lockdown actually influences women who experience violence, it is important not to stop or suspend perpetrators programs. It is important to continue keeping perpetrators accountable for their actions, also checking in and monitoring the situation. And the role of the perpetrators programs would be exactly this, to hold perpetrators accountable during this lockdown, as women don't have or have restricted access to help. There are, however, some important limitations, and one of them I would lay down here is the digital exclusion. So the system keeps accountable only those who have access to online services when in-person services are not accessible. So whenever we speak with men online, or also with women, the same applies to women's support services, there will be a certain percentage who is digitally excluded. Usually women are much more digitally excluded, and also persons from marginalized groups. And this is important to remember. Another limitation, as I have said, is that lockdown also changes the way the violence is applied. And here the cyber violence is very important. And this is something to look for. And the last but not least, also what is important now is to evaluate very well what has happened during the lockdown situation in the last 3-4 months, so that in the future waves or future similar crises, we are able to understand already what has worked well and what has, how the perpetrators' programs contributed to the safety, physical and psychological and well-being of women who experience violence.
Okay, thank you, Alicja. Maybe this is a good point to hear from Davide, shortly the experiences actually that tie in what Alicja was saying.
Thank you, Dean. So as far as perpetrator services, I think they played a very important role, especially here in Italy. As Alessandra said before, we don't have complete data right now, but we're studying it. So what happened was that obviously we had a very strange first week when lockdown happened. So we had to understand what was happening. And I'm talking especially from our point of view, the psychologists, people working in these services. But then we started with online counseling, and we started with online groups. And the situation in Italy, and I repeat, this is still incomplete data, but the situation in Italy, as far as perpetrator programs, doesn't seem, violence for people in perpetrator program doesn't seem to have increased. And we've been talking to each other in our Relive network, and we've been thinking of how this can happen, why this has happened. And I think that a very important part in very important role of the perpetrator programs is that we kept a sense of continuity with our men, with the men we're working with. We've kept presence. We didn't leave them alone, and many of them expressed their gratitude in this sense. So they were relieved, both men and their partners, that we kept on with our programs. We kept on with our online counseling, and we kept on with online groups. And where what Alicja said was right, there are still people even that they can't access digitally. They don't have any kind of digital access. So we kept I spoke with many people from Italy in order to prepare for today, and lots of people said that lots of colleagues said that in order to reach the perpetrators, they even called them on the phone. So even if they didn't have an internet connection, or the internet wasn't that good in order to provide a complete online session, they would reach them with a phone. So I think that this aspect was key in our work in order to help the perpetrators and to give a sense of containment, I would say.
Thank you. I think this is a good time to hear from the experiences from Rosie, or the Drive project, and also the guidance that you have been working on.
Sorry, it really helps if I unmute myself, doesn't it? So I think the role of perpetrator programs during COVID has been central. So If we think about the response to perpetrators, it's been really important at the moment that there's somebody who's able to kind of step in and be working around the risk management. So nationally, the advice and support we were kind of giving initially was around thinking about stepping away from some of the behaviour change work and stepping up with risk management and de-escalation work right at that very beginning point of COVID, just while we had kind of time to pull together and think about our response. So within Drive, we were certainly focusing on doing less behaviour change work and more of that kind of just making sure we were staying in contact with people. I think someone was saying before about the kind of inequalities of technology, and we've certainly found with our cohort that they found access to working online really difficult. So where we were thinking at the beginning that we might be able to be doing some of that behaviour change work online, actually a lot of those service users only had access to phones, and we did think or fear that contact would drop off with them, but actually we found that people were reaching out and in some cases wanting more contact than normal, particularly through that beginning stage. The majority of Drive clients, as I say, kind of have multiple complex needs, so they often have other areas like substance misuse, mental health, which they also were finding difficult at the beginning in terms of thinking about how they managed that during lockdown. So there's a lot of work that we were doing outside of kind of working with them around their abusive behaviour, but looking at the whole picture and trying to help them manage that risk. What we also have found really helpful in terms of managing risk during COVID is the relationships we already had with within the multi-agency arenas that sat around us. So one of the things that we had been implementing was perpetrator panels and some of that response. So really stepping up our work around disruption and working with other agencies to be able to do that. I mean, outside of coronavirus, we know that 1 in 3 violent crimes reported to police is domestic abuse. And with seeing a reduction nationally in some of the other crime types that have been being reported, the percentage of DA cases coming through with police is probably much higher at the moment. So we've certainly been trying to work with partners such as police to try and help keep victims safe at the moment and hold perpetrators accountable.
All right, thank you, Rosie. Now, networking seemed to work quite well in Germany. So, Daniela, would you like to share at least a piece of that experience? And then we'll turn to Melissa for a roundup of this first question.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, our Federal Association for the Work with Perpetrators, we have 76 member facilities in the whole of Germany. And we have a special situation, or we have had a special situation in Germany because we have 16 states. And during the COVID-19 crisis, there were different regulations and laws in all the states. So what have we done? We brought together all these perpetrators facilities in all over Germany. 76 are our members. And we did this very quickly because we want to exchange the information and we want to learn from each other how to do this, how to do that, how to do this point, and what has happened in this state and this and this. And so, just to show up the difference, in some states we are doing groups since 4 weeks, and in other states it's not allowed up till now. So we changed experiences, or we supported that the member facilities that they can talk to each other, because what mentioned Alicia before, it was the women support facilities. They suggested not to do online groups, for example, because they said it's not safe enough for the family of the perpetrators if we make online groups. So we were thinking about this suggestion, for example, now, and we decided all together how to handle it. And we decided not to offer online groups, for example. What is the role of the perpetrator program also? We thought about it and we decided it's the most important was to be available immediately and always for the perpetrators, to be available in the crisis. And so we did, we made a hotline for all over Germany. And then they gave advice and they sent the people to the state or to the facility who was responsible for this person. Yeah, on one hand, this was the networking that was very, very, valuable for us. And the other networking is what we discussed also with all the facilities members, the network in the country itself, to be in contact with all the institutions like Women Supporter, all the other institutions to be able to react immediately during the crisis. And this was our most valuable experience in the networking.
Thank you. So this crisis kind of emphasized the need to be well coordinated and like a community response to the new challenges, which brings us to Melissa. So if you would like to comment on what the new challenges were here that we heard today, and also the experiences from overseas.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. First, I just want to quickly say I'm in kind of this very comfortable chair because I had knee surgery 3 weeks ago. So I don't usually sit with my feet up when I present, but that's my situation today. But, I just want to say that for us, as part of Duluth and the Duluth area, that, we think about the role of a perpetrator program as one agency as part of a coordinated community response, or what we call as the CCR. So 2 things about what that means for us is that right in the beginning, we all came together and did a community message where each agency said something. We created a video. For example, our police chief made a very public statement sort of saying essentially to perpetrators of domestic and sexual violence in particular, we still will be responding. We still will make this a priority in our community's response. So that was one of the first things we saw as our role is part of that larger community. And then secondly, our next, based on our principles, is to speak with victims. So I contacted a number of victims and did interviews with them to get their sort of thinking. These are women not tied to men currently in the perpetrator program, but previously, to get their input about the things we should be thinking about. And, it's always just so rich with information that, we just don't think about. Like we're all really smart people dedicated to this work, but every time I do those interviews or a focus group, there's just things we just miss. And so that was really important for us. And also for us, I kind of mentioned this in one of the chats, is that, we didn't know about COVID. None of us did, of course, but in January 2019, I partnered with researchers. Many of you probably know Nicole Westmoreland at the University of Durham, who did the Mirabal Project study. And I wanted to see if video conference software groups was a good idea. Now, this was before COVID. So, we couldn't have planned this and, we never would have been able to. But our research phase was January 2019 to March 2020, right? Kind of where in the US anyway, I know we had a late response, and that's a whole other subject for another day here in the US. But essentially, we had been studying this through this research phase to see if doing groups, outside of in person was a good idea. And so part of what we learned through that process, and for all of us who do perpetrator programs, one of the just fascinating parts I just want to share with you is that in all of our evaluations with men, and when we've asked them, because half of the men had done an in-person, they did their first half of the group in person, they did their second half through us through video conference. So we had a bit of a sort of control group. Is the men said that being in their own physical space really made a difference, and that they found themselves opening up more, sharing more details about their lives. So building that trust with us. And because, we have the most contact with the men of all the people in the CCR, ended up being especially relevant during this time of this global pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, this is the first round of your contributions. Now we are going to move to the second guiding question, and which is, how do we ensure victim safety in the online procedures, of course, related to the lockdown? We are receiving a number of questions from the audience, and some are also related to the content of this guiding question, number 2. So if some of you wish to include your short response to some of these questions within the discussion that is coming up, I think that would be very good. Let's hear Daniela. Did you want to open up this round of panel?
Thank you, Dean. Yeah, like I said before, we decided not to do online groups because we cannot guarantee this safety of the victims. I mean, we cannot guarantee them in other cases also, but there were more dangerous aspects to do online groups. Yeah, that was the first point. The second one is that we do have in our standards that we also have contact to the partners of the perpetrators who we are in contact with, video support, online services, or on telephone. So we do more contact to them. Yeah, actually, we have one-time contact to the partners, and in this crisis, we call the partners maybe 3 or 4 times to ask how is the situation. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Alicja, would you like to contribute to this question, which is about the safety of victims? And we both are very much concerned about that in the lockdown time. There was...
Yes, definitely what Daniela has said already before me, and also in her first question. I think you gave an example of the core of what I would like to say. So that definitely survivors must be always at the center of our decision making. And also in terms of which platforms, which ways of communicating with survivors and with perpetrators. It all has to ensure the safety of women and children. In this case, WAVE has also created this COVID-19 resources page. It's also linked to WWP. They have also shared it, where you can also find a lot of resources related to safety of women, also in terms of safety online. And there are definitely many important tools, but what is very much important also in case there are online interventions, it's training and knowledge, because already the knowledge of all the risks that online services bring are already a key to keep also safe the women. We always need to remember that women's phones or computers might be under the control of the perpetrator, and this is a big risk that has to be taken under consideration. With our partners, WAVE has been also part of Project DISCO, Distant Counseling, where information about the safety and also training about distance counseling was discussed. So the information about these are also available online and have been very much discussed during the last 4 months, and the project was disseminated further because it's very useful to get this information. And definitely creating safety plans for women. This is very important, and I know that maybe the crisis situation was not exactly the moment to create them. Maybe now it's more the right moment to create those plans, but there are ways of doing it. Additionally, we have heard of, and we have good practice examples about online applications, such as application from Czech Republic that looks like a weather app, but is actually contact to women support services. And another application, which is actually from the US, DocuSafe, which allows to gather documents such as photos or descriptions of violence, which the woman can decide if she wants to share or if she wants to only keep safe under the pin of her phone. So once again, keeping the survivors in the center of our attention, understanding and getting all the training possible now, especially now when we have a bit relaxed situation in Europe, to get the training and be aware of all the consequences of online services and keeping online communication with survivor and the perpetrator.
Thank you. I just want to highlight one thing, that we are talking about the online support, but we of course must be very aware that there are many victims in our respective countries who would not even have access to that. So that brings, I would say, a completely new dimension that we should be aware of.
Definitely, and if I can add maybe one example that came from our member from Belgium. She has mentioned that the police in Belgium has proactively reached out to survivors of violence in order to check in with the safety. However, definitely such proactive ways of keeping in touch and checking if the survivors are safe. It also brings questions if it also, of course, such programs would need to be checked if they actually bring the safety of, if they don't endanger women further. But that's another practice example.
Yes. So, more thoughts from the panel? Yes, Davide.
Okay, yes, well, as a representative of a perpetrator program, I think that victim safety has to be our priority always. And so we have to think how to ensure this safety, even in online procedures, even in these times of crisis. What happened here in Italy is that obviously keeping in mind whether the perpetrator was at home, was at work, if the wife or said she was available, wasn't available. We tried to contact, keep in touch, even with the partners, because we usually have this tool, it's called partner contact, where when we start our program with the perpetrator, we inform, well, you know what I'm talking about, probably. And so we kept in touch, even during this crisis. We did, let's say, an extra call if the situation allowed it, was possible, and if it didn't endanger the situation, in order to further give support and tell the partners that they could have their, because even women's services was still running, so we informed them that they had this possibility, they could call, they could go, and so I think that what happened, what we did was keep using these tools that we have, and trying to adapt them, because we were caught off guard, as I said before at first, but then we tried to catch up. So we used these tools as better as we could, and when this is possible, we work jointly with the women's services. So if we had situations where the perpetrator was being following our programs and the partner was following the women's services program, we would keep in touch with the people working at the women's services, so to have a broader understanding of the situation. I think that these are mostly what tools that we implemented here in Italy.
Rosie, would you say that there are some specifics with high risk or high harm perpetrators regarding the victims, the outreach in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly similar to what Davide was just saying in terms of the response we've seen here in the UK. So for all of the victims linked to our high harm perpetrators on Drive, they have an independent domestic violence advisor who sits alongside them for the duration of the programme. So usually for around a year, has that contact on a regular basis to make sure they're safe, to support them and to work with them. A lot of the men that we work with are separated from their partners, but obviously so the safety there looks slightly different from those that were still in a relationship. So a lot of the work we did at the beginning of lockdown was to kind of risk assess every family unit. And so even if they weren't together, to be risk assessing everybody. And we were saying to all of the case managers, the perpetrator workers at that point, the focus of your work at the beginning should be looking for safe ways for victim contact with their independent domestic violence advisor. So, you almost in some ways are thinking about halting what you're doing, and the priority here is how does that contact happen between the victim and their support worker. So the case manager supported the victim workers in each case to find out what that means of contact was going to look like and try and put that in place where they needed to. We also then thought about, for those relationships where people are still together, how does that joint contact look like? So how, for example, perhaps do we set up the victim contact to happen at the time where we know that the perpetrator is on the phone with the perpetrator worker? And how do we try and balance that so we can try and make sure that that contact is safe as possible? But I think it's really important to say that when we're thinking about victim safety, it wasn't just the contact with the victim that we were thinking about. We were also thinking about contact with the perpetrator. So a lot of those things that you might do in ending a face-to-face session with somebody, in terms of thinking about, if they have been talking about something maybe which has brought up some emotions or other anger or other things, is you talk about that strategy and plan that strategy for, before they go home. How do they, hopefully they're leaving in a safe space to go home. But particularly where those couples were still living together, and the situation during lockdown, we were seeing increases in abuse anyway, how we had to make sure that any contact we did have with perpetrators was as safe as possible for the victim in the home. So really thinking very carefully through how you manage that risk with somebody on the phone, which is really difficult because there are things you can't do. So, and I think I said in the previous answer, a lot of our clients didn't have access to kind of the technology they needed to be doing, like we are now, face-to-face on a screen. A lot of the work was taking place on the phone. So you can't read things like body language. So it was really thinking about adapting those ways in which they were working to try and make sure that, you know, the workers themselves weren't doing anything to increase risk to victims, but also making sure that system was then in place as best as it could be, so the victims knew how to get help, and that was being proactively offered to them rather than them having to go and find it.
Thank you.
Dean, do you want me to go next?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. I saw your message. So one thing, you know, I had mentioned last time that we had done those interviews with women ahead of time, and kind of like when we were switching over to doing this, you know, in the pandemic. And a couple of things that the women provided us for input and suggestions were really, really helpful that we hadn't thought of. And one of those was, we had been doing this before, but to contact the women while the men were in group. So, and we had other staff do that contact so that we would affirm, you know, he was there. We'd send a text message that so-and-so is here today, showed up, you know, you can make contact with her. But the other thing that was really helpful that we did is we got a new phone number, and we got a new phone and number, so that if he did check our phone and call back, it sounded like, you know, hey, you've reached Melissa's phone, you know, leave a message and I'll call you back, right? So that if they did check it and call us back, they wouldn't get, you know, this is so-and-so perpetrator calling to, you know, talk to you about those sorts of things. So that was really, really helpful. And also just going off what Rosie was saying, you know, we also thought about it in terms of contact with the perpetrator and making it safe for the victims. So one of the things we did is that if men were living with their partners, you know, in the US, you know, we're pretty car dependent. We don't have a lot of public transportation like you do there. So, you know, and so that men who did have vehicles, and most of them did, we would have them go in their vehicles in a private space and participate with us there. And so, and that was, you know, either with, you know, video or phone, because we allowed that to happen during that time. And then just the last thing I just also want to mention about that is, you know, I guess I should have checked beforehand, but, you know, when we talk about perpetrator programs here in the US, I also work with women who use force, and a lot of those, of course, most of those women have also been victims. And so we found that the safety risks were so high working with women that we didn't do it in a group format at all, because so many of them were currently being, you know, experiencing a lot of coercive, controlling violence and abuse. So we just did some phone contact, but the risks were just so high with that group of women that we had that we decided not to.
Thank you. Would anyone want to add something around these two questions? The victim safety and the first one? Yes, Davide.
Yes, as Rosie and Melissa said, I would also like to add that one key aspect of keeping victim safety here in Italy was, in fact, the ongoing of the perpetrator program. As I said before in my first question, when we were caught a bit off guard in the first week because we didn't know anything about COVID or what was going to happen or how to live in a lockdown. But after we set up the program and we started doing online counseling again, individually and in groups here in Italy, I think that the safety of the victims was being guaranteed with these programs running, because as I said before, the perpetrators felt a sense of continuity. They were very grateful for the fact that we didn't leave them alone, or that we didn't stop seeing them. In sense, many social relationships were cut off, but we continued working. And so the fact that every week at that hour and that time we met and we talked about violence and problems and difficulties during the COVID pandemic, I think that was in fact a mean to prevent victim violence.
So am I right to say that one of the common things that you all spoke about is proactive outreach to the perpetrators, who were kind of more grateful for not being left alone, and then of course the proactive outreach to victims. My feeling is that this is something that all of you spoke about. So maybe this is we could come back to that later on for that preparation. But in this context, the outreach and proactive work of the Perpetrators Program, also regarding the support to victims, is embedded in how the society or the media actually highlight or do not highlight the issue. So we have a question here. So maybe some of you would like to comment, did the media in your country support the fight and the awareness of the rise of the risk of the domestic violence and the perpetrator program? Alicja, please.
So I will start because as a European network, so not specifically in my country, but in generally on the European scale, we have had a lot of contacts from press, from media, and we have been also monitoring. There was definitely a lot of attention about violence against women, especially domestic violence, although it's not the only form of violence that has been increasing during the lockdown. We have been using this time when press had the attention to this topic. However, what is very important for us, and what I have already mentioned at the beginning, the crisis was there already before.
Yes.
The crisis was there already before. And yes, we are very thankful that there is attention to the topic, but what does the attention bring? Now we see already there is less attention, but hopefully the topic will be there still, that we'll be talking about this more, that will be actually the awareness in the society, because women's support services also have done tremendous job on campaigning during this time to ensure that survivors of violence and that women experiencing violence know the numbers, know how to contact, how to get help. So I hope this awareness will continue and that media will help us. However, that was also chasing a bit of chasing the very hot topic, which has been there already before, because this is something what we experience every day, and sexism is there every day, and the press is contributing to it.
Right. But I would like to suggest that we would have to come up with some hard data, because that is still lacking in terms of numbers.
We just mentioned that all media have been asking us about data, but obviously this wasn't there. Right now, WAVE is conducting a survey to have comprehensive data in all European countries. Yeah. So this is coming.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Well, I'm looking at the time, and I would like to introduce our third guiding question, which is about the future, the near future, the uncertain future. And the question is about how can perpetrator programs prepare for future challenges, such as possible new lockdowns and continuing uncertainty, also in relation to the victim safety? Now, this is a very difficult question, because how do we prepare for something that is uncertain? And the common denominator of the COVID crisis, uncertainty, and things are changing actually from week to week. But still, we know now and have more experience than a few months ago. So briefly, if you can come up with the ideas based, of course, what you were saying and what you were doing. How do we prepare? How do we say to our network members, this is what you should do and prepare? So there's no excuse that we can be caught, without a guard after this. We hope it will not be, that the lockdown is not going to be that severe because of other reasons, but we still have to get ready. So please do contribute to how do we prepare for the uncertainty, but we know what we want to do. Rosie, yes, please.
I think we're suspecting as we start to, obviously the UK has been on lockdown for almost 3 months. We're starting to come to a place where we're starting to think about face-to-face contact with people again, and have started to slowly have some of that work happen. But we're prepared. I think one of the things we've had to do and really think about is prepare for the fact that we think there's going to be an escalation in disclosures of abuse once lockdown is really starting to lift and people are starting to be able to have space to be able to tell their stories again. So one of the things that we are preparing for is seeing this escalation of victims coming forward and telling us what's been happening. But also I think an escalation in risk within relationships, because the relationship is going to be changing again. So the last 3 months will have seen the ability for a perpetrator to control somebody really being quite tightly locked in because they've been stuck in the same home perhaps, or, kind of those networks outside have become broken and that victim has become really isolated. So as those things start to go back to normal, we're expecting to see an escalation in abuse and in risk. So we're really thinking about how we prepare for that. And what needs to be put in place. So for those people we're working with already, that's really thinking about risk assessment and how do we kind of step that up on a more regular basis to really be thinking about what are the scenarios that might happen and how do we manage these, but also how do we make sure that additional support is in place for victims if and when they need it. I think we're all realising that this probably isn't the last time we might be in lockdown either, that there's possibility of future lockdowns. And we are going to be, I think, better prepared when we go into this next time because of everything that we've learnt now in terms of how we'll quickly be able to transition over to doing that more indirect contact work, how we might be able to be setting that up with families, anyway, in case it happens, so it becomes an expectation rather than reaching out and trying to make it happen. But I think what we've also seen, we've undertaken a national survey of practitioners in terms of thinking about what they've seen as well. So some of the biggest feedback that's come through, I think I mentioned earlier, is that they're seeing reported increases within the families they're working with where domestic abuse is present in substance misuse, mental health need, etc., etc. So I think we need to be prepared for all of that as well, and be really thinking about what the support needs to look like around all of those other factors that might be kind of affecting the level of harm, not the domestic abuse, but the level of harm. So one of the things that we've been doing here is last year we launched a call to action. So the Drive Partnership, Respect, Safe Lives and Social Finance launched a national call to action to government asking for a perpetrator strategy, which is something that we've not had before. So as part of that, I think what's really important as we're coming out of lockdown and looking into the future, that across different organisations in different sectors, both within our country but also internationally, we need to be saying the same thing. We need to be talking about the fact that we now know what we have in terms of domestic abuse interventions isn't enough. We need a better response from all governments in terms of supporting those interventions. We need better, kind of economic support, but we also need more joined up support so that we can ensure that interventions are not patchy and different in every part of the country, but that something is consistent. So I think that's a really important lesson that we're learning. People coming to us and saying, you have support here in one area, but there's nothing at all somewhere else. So we really need to, I think this is really drawn for us, the need that we need to see that change as well.
Okay.
Okay. One thing, I was thinking about when everyone was talking that occurred to me is how much of what we learned during our research phase applied. And, in the US, I'm embarrassed by our response to COVID. I'll just say that, I don't know if we'll get a second wave. To us, it feels like a continued. It's just going to go on forever because it's such a fractured response. So that's my one political statement here, I'll say. And the thing for us, though, that I would say that we've learned because the response is so different, and our video conference software group, takes men from all over the US, not just from Minnesota. So a couple of things that we've learned over that time is that there's, of course, 2 gaps in men participating, but a few of our communities have actually bought devices, bought iPads. So kind of like how here in the US, our schools loan them out, to kids in school. Our probation office has begun to buy some and then loan them out to the men to use during their group time with us. And then for men who don't have a good internet connection, they've also done 2 things that have helped. They've given the men a hotspot device, or what they have done is they have actually paid for wireless internet for the time of the group. And then the third response they've done is they've actually opened up, like in one of the probation officers had a large community room. So they sat all the men, more like kind of 10 feet apart. And then we were up on the screen. So they were together, like we had 4 of them in one room and they participated. And we found that worked for us. I will say the one thing we've learned also when we think about for the future that's been the biggest gap is being able to monitor the men's illegal drug and alcohol use. That probation has not figured that out, and we rely on them to do that. So our probation agencies have said that, that's a huge hurdle for them that, of course, affects us. And then also, I would say in terms of facilitating group during video conference software, we've learned a lot about how it's very different than doing it in person, what you're able to do that's better and what you can't do because of the limitations of the format. And then lastly, I'll just say, I live in Minnesota where, of course, the conversation here is about, abolishing the police. And one of the things for us on top of the pandemic has been that what women have said in focus groups is that, for them, justice would mean men to change, which we've seen an increase of volunteer men coming to our groups, which has been interesting for us. Even just in the last month, we've gotten more phone calls, from men who want to volunteer. And, we always sort of ask how they found out. And one man recently joked, he said, well, I don't need a probation officer. My wife is it because she says, if I don't go, she's going to leave me. So I would also say that, as another sort of big social issue here. And then lastly, I'm jealous when I'm not sure, I'm sorry which one of you talked about the hotline, but it's a huge gap for us in the US is for perpetrators to be able to have a place to call. So I'd love to talk, I think it was Daniela, it was you who mentioned it, but I'd love to talk to you after this about that, because what we found here is that, men were just calling the victim hotline because they really had nowhere else to call. And so because at the beginning of each of our groups during COVID, we kind of did what we call the COVID check-in. And to Rosie's point, we found that the men just changed their tactics, right? So men would say things like, I have too much free time. I can't do the sports I want to do. I'm laid off from work. So what I find myself doing is sitting all day, looking at her on social media all day. Who's she talking to? Where is she going? What is she doing? And so, all those sort of tactics, as Rosie eloquently described, just sort of the social world in which we live has changed, but the intent hasn't of perpetrators.
Yeah, thank you. So, Daniela, how what is your advice to prepare the programs around Europe, not only in Germany, or maybe in the United States as well?
No, come on. Yeah, Rosie and Melissa, they mentioned so many aspects already. First of all, our government, they supported us with we have a big campaign against domestic violence. And in this time, they supported with placards and with sports in the TV and with advertisement against domestic violence. That was very helpful also. Of course, I also I wish that they will continue with this, yeah, but it was really helpful because they put the phone numbers for the victims, also for the perpetrators. That was really great. But we did also create some leaflets for all over Germany for the perpetrators. And I mean, we made all our experiences in these 3 months, let's say 3 months, and it is still now very complicated for the perpetrators, for the family, for the victims. Sometimes I think now they're coming up all the problems maybe that were hidden in the last 3 months. I don't know if you can share this, but now they are talking about some things and problems that they weren't talking before at the telephone and the video online services. So we create these leaflets in different languages, and we are still working with them with this. And we are always invite the perpetrators, if they are living together still with their partners, to talk about all these aspects of the leaflet with their partners, with their children. And so we take our experience and with this leaflet, and so we prepare a little bit maybe a coming situation of lockdown again. And if there will not be a lockdown, that's great. But then maybe they are better prepared for other crises, maybe family crisis or working crisis, or I don't know what kind of crisis. Yeah.
Dan, you're muted.
Sorry, Dean, your mic.
Yeah. I think what you said in your last sentences is also important. The COVID crisis has increased the awareness of how large-scale crises actually affect, in practice, our work and also the safety of the victims and the families. So this is, if we can use that as a learning experience, that could be a good outcome also. Davide, I would like to ask you, what are the practical things that you could recommend as being better prepared, also with relation to your work in prisons? You are muted.
Sorry. So I'll start with the general perpetrator work. What Daniela said was absolutely right. We have to see this COVID crisis not only as a health crisis, but it's also an economical crisis. The situation here in Italy is quite dire, and should we face a second lockdown, the effects on the economy would be devastating. And many people would lose their jobs, and we know that losing the job problems is a risk factor. So we have to work and be prepared for this possible new lockdowns, possible effects. What we can do now is promote ourselves, work with people who, with other agencies who work with other people, such as in your region, in your area, to let them know that there are services for perpetrators, so that and how to, and I'm thinking about the Engage roadmap that the WWP developed. This is a great tool for us to let people know what perpetrator work is and how it works, and how to refer perpetrators to perpetrator programs. So my advice would be this, that in fact, people should start networking, should start promoting these perpetrator programs, so that in case of a second lockdown, in case of another rise in violence, the people who get to work, such as social workers or other people working in this area, may refer the perpetrators to the perpetrator programs. Regarding prison, I would say I've worked in prison until the lockdown. Prison has a very strict rules. So as soon as the lockdown was implemented here in Italy, we were banned from entering prison, and they were very slow in reacting with online counseling. So we didn't manage. We couldn't go on with our work in prison, and as of today, it hasn't resumed yet. I know somebody who has started going back working in prison, obviously not in a group context, but in an individual context, because they can't guarantee health safety. But it's very different from area to area. Here in my city, Genoa, we haven't been allowed yet back in prison. So,
but Davide, would you say that violent men, perpetrators who are in prison, do they have the same or increased or decreased need for this kind of proactive contact, for care?
Yes, well, working in prison is, as I said before, I think one of the key aspects of working with, in general, with perpetrators is to give a sense of being there and to listen to people and to listen to their anguish, to listen to their anxiety, to listen to their emotions. Especially in prison, this was not possible for us, because people would just, from one week to another, they didn't have anybody to talk to. And of course, talking to each other is one way of doing, but it's not the same as talking to a professional. So I would say that we missed a great opportunity to continue, not being able to continue with our work in prison, because people, I believe they suffered the most, in the sense that they were abandoned. They were left to themselves. They didn't have any support. So I think that it would have been a great opportunity to keep in touch with them too, but this wasn't possible. And I would advise, if possible, to keep in touch, even with online tools.
Okay, thank you. Well, looking at our schedule and also the questions that you as panelists have already received, I think we should move to our question and answer period with the audience. And I again invite our audience to pose the comments and questions, perhaps specifically to some of the panelists or to all the panelists and use your chat. So let us start with some of the questions that we already have. And I would like you panelists to keep your responses focused on what is being asked. So maybe the first one goes to Rosie. You did mention a disruption in your first discussion about the first guiding question. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So the drive intervention has three kind of main prongs of work in terms of contact with perpetrators. So we have the support arm. So as say, most of our service users complex need, substance misuse, etc. So we work with them in order to address those needs, which helps us to keep victims safer. Behaviour change arm, so one-to-one behaviour change sessions. But then we also have the disrupt arm. So we use disruption with perpetrators that are engaged with us, but also those that aren't. It can look very different for different people. It might be as simple as, we're not actually having direct contact with that individual, but we're doing a whole piece of multi-agency work behind the scenes. So we might be working with the police and children's social care and the victim service to be able to put a safety plan in place that is disrupting the perpetrator's behaviour, but we're not actually working with the perpetrator. Or it can be much more direct. So examples of that historically, for example, might be that we, because we're doing a whole risk assessment around the perpetrator, we're gathering lots and lots of information. And it may be that the victim is wanting, for example, an injunction to be served on the perpetrator, but it's not possible because nobody knows where he is. So Drive might be gathering all of that information and finding out where he is. And then, for example, one case we worked with the police, and he was arrested for driving without a license, which meant that he was in custody and we were able to go and serve the injunction. So disruption is very much thinking around how we work with others to be able to put barriers in place to try and prevent that person from being able to be, commit abusive behaviour. So, and keep victims and children as safe as possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Did that answer the question? Yeah.
Yes, I think so. We'll
Good.
see. We'll see if we get a comment to your comment. Now another question. I think it should go to Alicja, and this is about the positive examples of reaching out and supporting marginalized groups or the isolated communities that at the time of crisis are at special risk of being neglected because they are hard to reach anyway, and all the measures to attend to the needs of people are not really tailored to the small groups, marginalized groups.
So first of all, I would have to say those groups sometimes are not small. Sometimes there are very, very big groups of marginalized people. And I would not say that we have any best practice examples, but we have also heard from our network that the in-person work has been happening despite of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there were certain neighborhoods, for example, very much overpopulated Roma neighborhoods in Serbia, where our members were still visiting and helping the women. And another examples would be conditions of women refugees who were still in camps, very often without any hygienic supplies and sometimes without access to bathrooms, and very often in the same rooms as the perpetrators of violence. So what I actually want to mention here is the systemic character of the violence that we are experiencing, and especially that those women are experiencing, and the bigger structural changes that are needed for those communities to actually be protected from violence, and those women to be protected from violence, which would have been also part of the answer to the previous question I had, that we definitely need to look on the big structure. And in our upcoming months, we should really definitely focus on speaking about those issues and showing how much the COVID-19 crisis, also economically, has influenced women and other marginalized groups, how it contributed to experiencing violence. And also for us in the future, it might also influence our funding, because we know already that there is a probability that the values and rights funding of European Union will be decreased. Those are very scary views of the future, and we really need to think of systemic changes that will ensure that no person, despite of their origin, experiences violence.
Now we have a question probably for the old panelists, and please feel free to join. And that is about the context of victim safety. We know that once the violence is revealed and the victim is approached or victim accesses the services, That is a very important step forward. But then there are many unknown victims, those that are currently not connected to any services. Has the COVID crisis increased the risk for them? You were talking about all the limits in providing the services, but here we have the question in the context of victim safety about the tools and strategies used in your countries for the not identified victims, but who are there living in fear and pain. Yes, please, Melissa.
Yes, I'm happy to start just to say that one of the strategies that we've used is to make contact with women that we do know in the community, to connect us with other women. But in part, we found one of the most effective strategies is not to think about sort of traditional services, but we always, we use the term sort of advocate as a sort of victim support staff term. And so we see part of our role is to create advocates in communities, right? So that it doesn't always have to be a formal sort of connection between agency and victim, because, we've often find, particularly with women who haven't made that contact, that's a step that's too scary, too unsafe, for a whole bunch of reasons. So just one quick example is that in rural Minnesota, we worked with a group of women who they call themselves the church ladies. They've named themselves that, but they wanted to be that group of women who could learn and understand about how they could be more helpful. They talked about things they did that they knew they shouldn't have done, that they think, created less safety, and they wanted to learn more about how they could do it. So part of our strategy has been to create informal groups of people to help.
Mm-hmm. So this is again about enlarging the network, the safety network for in this informal aspect as well. Probably it's the media as well who can play a role in here. Any other thoughts about? Yes, Alicja.
Yes, definitely in the last 4 months, there have been many innovative ways of reaching out to women. First of all, I have already mentioned campaigning. And the second part was innovative ways of informing women about how to get help. And definitely, in order to get help, a woman would need to research the online services. So she would need to be aware of the problem and that she needs to research. So we had members, for example, trying to add the information about helpline on main news channels and in certain websites where normally women also go, but it's not definitely about violence. It's not specifically about violence. So in this way, women who would normally not see those channels of getting help, they would be informed and they could think later to contact women's support services.
Thank you. We have another question which actually focuses on the program providers, the staff, the facilitators, the people like you and I. And the question is, how has this situation, the lockdown, the online work, the feeling of responsibility, affected your staff? Have you done something new in this regard to take care of the professionals and their needs? And I would like to add that this is also in a way leading into our next, into one of the workshops after the break. Daniela, please do.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy about this question because our experience is, and all the member facilities they talked about, that we put much energy into to help the families, to help the perpetrators. But we are personal in the same crisis, not in the violence crisis, but also in this crisis, what has happened here in this world, and everybody has to find a place and an opinion and all this trouble around. And so it's a really good question, because I mean, we as a federal association for the work with perpetrators of domestic violence, for the facilities, we made very quickly, and I mentioned it before, online services like to come together for all the facilities. So we shared our experiences, and we shared not just our experiences about the work with perpetrators. We shared our experience about our problems. I think you know what I'm talking about, and we supported this exchange because we ourselves, we felt uncomfortable with a lot of situations, and of course we knew our members, they also are feeling uncomfortable with some situations, because maybe helpless, because they cannot help, they lost the contact with the perpetrators, but also their own problems. So I hope you get me. I'm sorry, my English, I'm not a native speaker, sound like you, but I try. Okay, thanks.
So one thing that we've found that, that the work can be, enriching to our lives and stressful anyway outside of COVID. One of the things that we found that became particularly stressful for our staff was there was a whole bunch of factors that happened that we didn't know how to address, that in some that were really dangerous and scared our staff. Just to give one example is that when we do video conference software groups, we kind of document kind of the conversation. And one of the things we learned the hard way is to verify that the email address that the men have given us is actually just his and not his partner's. And we had one of the men who they shared an email address, and we didn't know that. And she read all these things, and, it became the catalyst for her to confront him about a number of things. And she ended up getting injured, he ended up being physically violent towards her. So that was one. And I'll just very quickly tell you, we had a worse situation where we were doing phone calls with some of the men because if they didn't have video conference software, and one of our staff called one of those men, and he happened to be in his car driving, saying he's about to go kill his partner and her new boyfriend because he just found out that she was in a new relationship. And so, that sort of level of stress, and then of course, that was one that, we ended up, unfortunately, being able to figure out how to get the police to have contact with them. But the other thing is just about doing with groups in home is about the kids. And so there's a question about the kids. We all have, I don't know if any of you have kids, but boy, homeschooling was a real challenge, for me. And I know it was a big thing for the men. And just for the men having more access to the children, there are many, many times where we were really concerned about the safety of their children, times when kids would just kind of stop over at dad's house, and just even some of the stories that the men. So part of what we just learned very, very quickly is that this enhanced everything that we worried about before. Things were actually happening sort of in real time that we worried about before. So, we spent a lot more time with each other. And so, but also that's also additional time, right? And time can also be wearing as well and cause stress. So we definitely don't have it figured out, but I can just tell you, over these 18 months of the research phase, we had a lot of situations that we just never would have have thought about that really impacted our staff. And I'm surprised they're still working. I mean, they're very dedicated, but, to have turnover too would be another additional sort of stressor for us.
Davide?
Thank you. Well, absolutely. I think these were challenging times even for us. And the the issue of our health, of our well-being, obviously came up multiple times. And during our staff, we took some time to share how we were feeling, because everybody reacted differently to this lockdown, different situations, different. Some people had kids, some people didn't. Some people live in flats, some people live in the countryside. So many different situations that had different impacts on us. What we focused on was some time off. We agreed that it was necessary for us to have some time off and to concentrate on our needs. And so otherwise we would go very quickly in a burnout situation. We know that social and health workers are very at risk at developing burnout syndrome. So what we did was actually concentrate on our needs, on our well-being. So we read books, everybody did what they liked and what was possible for them in that moment. Some people dedicated their time to gardening, some people to reading, some people to cooking. But I think that what was important for us was to concentrate on what we felt was some time off to your mind, because you have a lot you intake a lot. And sometimes I say you have to digest the thing that you intake. When working with people, you work with emotions, you work with difficult emotions to process. So you need some time for yourself, some time for your well-being. And it was very important to find a moment to share these well-being or not so well-being between our staff members. So we dedicated half an hour every staff meeting, which is once a week, to share how we were feeling, how we were doing, stuff like that.
Did you also have regular supervision, online supervision among the staff, apart from the staff meetings?
Yes, we had. That was very helpful too.
Yeah. Now, Melissa has mentioned the homeschooling as a problem for the families and the perpetrators and the victims and children there. But it came to my mind that also for our staff, homeschooling and working from home on these really, really serious matters, as Davide has just explained, is strenuous. Actually, do the people have time to do that? Privacy to work with the victims or the perpetrators? These are all the things that come up in our discussions. But we'll have some more time to look into the staff issues in one of the workshops just after the break. So thank you very much for being so creative and active in this panel. I have the feeling that we could go on for at least half an hour or an hour. But before closing this session, I would like to outline the further program that is going to go on right after this session. If you would like to attend the workshop A, which is the COVID crisis and who helped the helpers, then you can stay in this room. If you would like to attend the workshop B, which is multidisciplinary response to domestic violence during lockdown at the Family Justice Center in Antwerp, then you should go back to the lobby and enter session B. And this will be the same thing for the second round of workshops. Between the first and second round of workshops, there will be a lunch break. Please be on time for the workshops after the lunch break. And now we have, I just want to mention that our mini conference is being recorded and it will be available later on for people to view. So now we will have 10-minute break, and we will resume, or 15-minute break, and we'll resume at 11:25 directly in the respective workshops. So thank you for your gracious time, ideas, and sharing, and see you later just in a while.